Whenever someone says the word timeless or classic with regards to fashion, no matter the context, I always picture a white button-up shirt. Someone like Audrey or Katharine Hepburn comes to mind. And if there is one garment every collection must contain, it is the white button-up shirt. Well, that sounds monotonous. Every single collection containing basically the same garment, you may say? Absolutely not. This garment has been around thousands of years with the right mental dexterity. And while it has been comparatively unchanged over the past 100 years or so, I would argue no two white button-up shirts have ever been the same. Whether it's a subtle difference like cuff style or hem length, or something totally off the wall, every designer has their own twist on the white button-up. And once your version of a white button-up is established, you can tweak and play with those codes to create thousands of variations. You can make something totally avant-garde, and if there is a recognizable collar present, it instantly reads as clothing. I mean, yes please. But you already made a white button-up, you may be thinking. And yes, I made a white button-up shirt dress based on an early 19th century shirt waist, and I absolutely love the result and the codes, and I definitely want to use some of those codes to create a true classic, timeless button-up shirt. Okay, so I've got this lovely girl, and this is the shirtwaist dress that I made before. I've just remembered as I've been trying to find the pattern for her that I actually drafted out all of these details, but didn't add them to the pattern. I drafted them like directly onto the fabric. The original is not a button-up. The original does not have this placket. It has a collar option, and then it's got like a neck strip around it, so it doesn't have any of the details that you would normally iconically see on a white button-up shirt. When I think of a button-up shirt, the iconic details that come to mind are obviously a collar, placket, buttons, obviously, collar stand, the curved hem at the bottom, which is, going to be a pain in the butt, but what can you do? And cuffs. This doesn't have any of those things on the pattern. I'm actually gonna go through my patterns and see if I have a pattern for a white button-up shirt, because I could draft my own just from scratch, but that to me is kind of like literally trying to reinvent the wheel when this is one of the most iconic basic garments that's out there. There are so many patterns for a white button-up shirt. So let's see what I have. This is a pattern hack that I saw on Ash LG's channel, by the way, just giving credit where credit's due. Anyway, I have this, which I think is more in line with that classic Audrey Katharine look. It doesn't have the placket down front. I would assume that this is like an all-in-one collar and facing situation. So it's got a clean front, which means that it can kind of like have that open, clean look at the collar. Could be interesting. What I really like about this one is that it's got this relaxed, dropped shoulder to it. Use some mental gymnastics. It kind of reminds me of an 18th century men's shirt. I kind of actually just want to make this one as is to see how this works and how it feels when it's on. Yeah, I think I need to make this guy. So I'm gonna treat that kind of like as my mock-up, probably end up adding some of these details into it. So I don't know, let's make this and we'll see. Of course, if one is making a shirt, then one needs proper shirting fabric. I could go on a diatribe here about thread count and yarn ply. I've taught many a construction class, and I've seen many a quilting cotton made into a button-up shirt, and to my knowledge, none of those students were sucked into sewing Hades for their crimes. Instead, I'll just say that a shirting fabric should feel good to the touch, and it should hopefully be durable. This is a nice-ish white shirting I've had since my New York days. Didn't really care that much, as this is just a pattern test. We'll just montage right through this guy, and I'll give you the juicies when we reach the proper shirt. Okay, I'll point out a couple of things. This is obviously a domestic pattern and has 5/8" seam allowances. My industrial machine does not, so I marked out a seam allowance guide in Sharpie. No worries, this will come off with some rubbing alcohol. I hope. I properly finished this shirt, just in case I liked it, but it's also good to use tools to test out finishing techniques, not just size. I finished the seams on this with a flat felled seam. Okay, this was that all-in-one collar and facing thing which was also interfaced. I've never seen a piece finished in this way, so here goes. I cut out the pieces in both self and interfacing and stitched on the lower piece to each. I then sewed the interfacing to the self, right sides together, along the inner neckline. I flipped the interfacing to the wrong side, encasing the raw stitched edge and putting the wrong sides, including the side of the interfacing with the adhesive, together. I pressed this, which adhered the interfacing to the wrong side of the self using an organza pressing cloth. Stay tuned for how that worked out. Okay, so here we are. I've got this shirt that I just made and then this shirt that I made before. I don't really love this shirt. I think that the big problem with it is that this probably should have been done with a sew-on interfacing. When I think about it, I don't know how prevalent adhesive interfacings were in the 1950s when this pattern came out, and that's causing a couple of problems. I pressed this whole thing to activate the adhesiveness. The problem is that at the seam allowances, like right here and also at the back of the collar, it is bubbling because there's no adhesive there, it's on the seam allowance. It's kind of weird. This collar situation is kind of like a little bit intense for me. It kind of feels like it's taking over my body. I do like the relaxed sleeve and the relaxed body. I will probably use the body shape from this. I'll probably use the neck shape from this, which is going to be tricky because the tucks go into the neckline here. We'll figure it out. I'll use the neckline from that, put it onto this body. I will use this collar and then maybe play around with some of this shaping onto it. The placket and everything I'll put on this shirt. This sleeve head is actually a little bit big for an eased sleeve head, in my opinion. It was kind of hard for me to ease it into the arm side. So what I think I want to do is actually make it a little bit bigger and put some gathering into it so that it's like a gathered sleeve head, which to me is more of a like historical nod. I thought I was gonna really love the gathered cuffs. I don't. I think that I don't know. I don't really know why I don't like them. I just don't. So I think what I want to do is have the gathered top right here and then have it taper down into like a clean cuff line. One thing I really do like is the hem. Sorry, pardon my mess. I finally got a selfie stick, so something about this proportion just doesn't feel quite right to me. Maybe it's supposed to be tucked in. I think I'm gonna add maybe like 6 or 7 inches to the bottom of this. I would say that this was a pretty successful mock-up. Not the most successful shirt, but that's fine. Because a white shirt is intimidating, right? There's no place to hide on it. It's white, crisp fabric. Like, you kind of have to be pretty precise when you're sewing it. So I can get out all of those jitters and kind of approach the next one a little bit more confidently. So I think that this was actually a really good use of time. Feel free to disagree with me. Anyway, let's go and do the real thing. I was right, I did not document the changes I made to the Laura Ashley pattern, so that was fun to refigure out. At least now it's on paper. I ended up adding 8 inches to the body of the 1950s pattern and added the neckline from the Laura Ashley pattern, which I got by pinning together the tucks in the pattern. I adapted the Laura Ashley collar to match the shape of the 1950s collar. I used the bottom of the Laura Ashley sleeve with the top of the 1950s sleeve, and I added about 5 inches to the width of the sleeve head to create some gathers. The original Laura Ashley pattern also doesn't have a cuff, so I drafted one with a rounded edge to match the rounded edge of the collar stand. This linen is absolutely gorgeous, and I'll let you in on a secret, just don't come for me. I don't always wash linen before I sew it on a machine. No, really, hear me out. Whatever gross industrial grade starch they size this stuff with is phenomenal at keeping it flat. Linen gets so wonky after being washed, and it is impossible to press it totally flat, and even more impossible to keep it totally flat. Just wash a swatch to make sure it doesn't shrink, sew with a non-shrinking thread, and wash before you wear because there are some really nasty sizing agents out there. I matched the front body panels to the back body panel at the side seams, right sides together, and stitched. I sewed the shoulder seams while I was at it, and let me just say there was a lot of ease in this pattern, starting with the shoulder. I pressed the seams open, trimmed the seam allowance from the back of the seam, pressed the full seam allowance over to meet the actual seam, then folded it over and stitched along the folded edge. There are a couple extra steps to this flat felled seam process, but it creates a really crisp, even seam. To create the placket, I pressed the seam allowance toward the right side of center front. I then folded and pressed the 1-inch placket to the right side. I stitched right along the edge of the inner fold and the outer edge. This was the top placket, the under placket was the same, but everything was pressed to the wrong side instead. I pressed a 1/4 inch double-folded hem to the wrong side of the body, and stitched along the very edge. The curves are intimidating, and they will inevitably come out a little wrinkled, but so they do on industrial-made shirts too. Ever seen a collar and been frustrated that it flares away from the shirt? I trimmed 1/8 of an inch from the seam allowances of the sides and outer edge of what will be the undercollar. I matched the upper collar to the new edge of the undercollar exactly, as though I hadn't cut away the 1/8 of an inch. I stitched around the sides and outside, easing the two pieces together, which creates some extra fullness in the upper collar. I trimmed nearly the full seam allowance from the curve of the collar. I pressed the edges slowly and carefully, allowing the undercollar to pull the fullness of the upper collar to create a tiny lip. I further secured this turn in place by stitching the seam allowance to the undercollar along the very edge. This stops the seam from being seen along the edge of the collar, but it also helps it hug the body of the shirt once it's turned. Next, I matched the inner and outer collar stands right sides together and slipped the collar in between them so that the raw edge of the collar matched with the top of the collar stand. The right side of the upper collar should be against the right side of the inner collar stand. There's a good amount of ease here too, and some funky curves, making this a perfect place to practice notch etiquette. Once turned out, this should start to resemble a collar with stand. I promise those curves were properly trimmed. I matched the outer collar stand to the neck of the shirt. Again, notches are your friend here. I stitched all this in place and pressed the seam allowance up into the collar stand. I pressed the seam allowance of the inner collar stand to the wrong side. I could have done this earlier before everything was attached. Oh well. This is the most satisfying part of shirt construction to me. Never a fan of stitching in the ditch, I hand-stitched the inner collar stand edge down using a ladder stitch directly on top of the existing stitch line to keep everything invisible. Now for the sleeves. I cut the slits of the sleeve cuffs and attached a self-bias binding exactly as I did in the shirtwaist dress video. I folded the sleeves and stitched up the side seams. Always be careful to mirror the sleeves to create a right and a left sleeve. Nice to have a proper use for my sleeve board for once. I finished the sleeve seams in another flat felled seam. I trimmed 1/8 of an inch from the outer 3 edges of the cuff as I had done for the collar. I matched the edges of the cuff to the edges of the cuff edge slit, stitched it in place, and hand-stitched the inner cuff over all the rawness similarly to the inner collar stand. I stitched 2 lines of gathering stitches between my gathering notches at the sleeve head, one at 1/4 of an inch and one at 3/4 of an inch, which means I'll be sewing between them when I stitch the sleeve in place. I find this keeps the gathers nice and neat. I gathered up the sleeve head to match the arm side and fit the sleeve to the body with the sleeve right side out inside the inside out body. I stitched the sleeve in place, then flat-felled the sleeve cap seam allowance over the raw edges of the armscye. Finishing the armhole is always the most precarious part of a bodice for me, and especially in the case of this scenario with all of its gathers, a serged edge may have been the best option. But I hate serged edges, and while yes, flat-felling gathers is a little bulky, it's not as bad as you'd think. The overplacket and cuffs got more machine buttonholes. I attached these vintage shell buttons to the underplacket and these vintage shell buttons to the cuffs. I bet you all thought that you were going to be seeing a reveal right now of the finished garment and it was going to be beautiful and all of that. So did I, my friends, so did I. But then I tried the garment on and it turns out that I do not like the sleeves. It is supposed to be a block, and so how am I going to build on this if it's not right? So I've been obsessing. Essentially the problem is that it's got a really big sleeve head, like there's a lot of volume right here, and then it kind of tapers down into an incredibly narrow, maybe a little bit too narrow wrist. It kind of looks like a chicken drumstick, but like a cartoon version of a chicken drumstick. It's not a big change that I'm making, but unfortunately it does mean that I have to redo the entire sleeve. So it's going to be gathered at the sleeve cap, and then it's going to be gathered a little bit at the wrist, just to keep that volume more consistent throughout the sleeve. Hopefully it won't look like chicken. I guess that the moral of the story here is that you can take your time, you can do everything right, and sometimes it just doesn't. Yeah, I'm just going to sit here and finish up my 2 sleeves that I've already made. Now the reveal. Well, that was a bit more of a journey than I was expecting, but all's well that ends well, I suppose. This is going to be a pretty good block to use moving forward, and I can't wait to start playing around with it. If this hasn't been apparent, I've been experimenting with some basic codes to use in my collection. I've got a couple more basic ideas I'm exploring, and there will always be more historicism to explore, but I'm getting to a point where I have enough collection language established that I can start designing and making full looks, which is super exciting. If you've enjoyed this video, I always appreciate a thumbs up. And hit subscribe if you love playing with basic ideas in fashion. I have a highly anticipated technique video coming up in about a fortnight. Bye. Timeless button-up shirt.